Take two. Body, Mind, and Death Introduction. Some philosophers have maintained that a human being is simply his body and nothing else besides. Thus, Nietzsche once remarked, "Body am I entirely and nothing more, and soul is only the name of something in the body." The same view is also expressed in an epigram coined by the German philosopher Feuerbach. "A man," he said, "is what he eats." However, the great majority of philosophers, and especially those with a religious background, have agreed that human beings are something more than their bodies, and this something more has variously been referred to as the mind, the self, or the soul. Is a human being really a mind in addition to his body? If he is, what exactly is this mind and how is it related to the body? Finally, are there any good grounds for supposing that his mind survives the disintegration of his body? These are the main questions discussed in the selections contained in the present section. At least at first sight, it seems exceedingly plausible to contend that a human being is something over and above his body. Things like houses and mountains, and also, of course, human and animal bodies are publicly observable. All these physical objects have extension and occupy positions in space. By contrast, only a person himself can experience his feelings, sensations, dreams, or thoughts. A dentist can observe the cavity which causes his patient's pain, but only the patient himself can feel the pain. If I am angry and shake my fist, an outsider can see this manifestation of my anger, but not the anger itself. Assuming that a person's dreams or thoughts can be correlated with certain specific movements of brain molecules, it is theoretically feasible that scientists might one day perceive these molecular motions. But they would not, even then, be experiencing the dreams or thoughts of the person whose brain they were observing. Feelings, sensations, dreams, and thoughts are the sort of phenomena which are usually classified as mental. In calling them mental, philosophers usually mean that, unlike physical objects, they are private or directly knowable by one person only. Some philosophers also include having no extension and no spatial location in the meaning of mental. This, however, might prove a confusing definition, since certain sensations and feelings do seem to have extension and a location in space. It is plausible, then, to maintain that a human being possesses a mind as well as a body. It seems just as reasonable to hold, in the absence of special considerations to the contrary, that there are causal connections between body and mind. To give a few simple illustrations. Cavities in teeth cause pain. The impact of light waves on the retina leads to visual sensations. Contact of the tongue with food causes taste sensations. Indigestion gives rise to morbid feelings. Consumption of large quantities of alcohol produces hallucinations. Some drugs make us calm, others more excited. All these are instances of causal influence by the body on the mind, but there seems just as ample evidence of causal relations in the opposite direction. A person who is ill and has nothing to live for is far less likely to recover than one who has many interests and is filled with hope. Expectations of pleasant encounters affect our body in one way, expectations of unpleasant encounters in quite another. Embarrassment causes us to blush, fear to tremble, happiness to smile, and sometimes to cry. Perhaps the plainest cases of mind-body causation are voluntary movements. A man intends to see the tennis matches at Forest Hills, and all other things being equal, he really gets there. It would seem very odd indeed to maintain that in this and similar situations, the intention or volition was not part of the cause of the person's action. Philosophers who first make a distinction between the body and the mind, and who then proceed to assert that there are causal influences in both directions, are known as dualistic interactionists. They are divided among themselves according to their views about the nature of the body and of the mind, respectively. Confining ourselves to the latter topic, we have to distinguish between those who, like the scholastics and Descartes, adopt a substance theory, and those who, following Hume, adopt a serial or bundle conception. The point here at issue may be explained by the following question. Is a human being something additional to A, his body, B, the various experiences he goes through, C, the relations between these experiences, such as similarity, causation, and memory, and D, his capacities, habits, temperament, and ideals? That is, his dispositions to act and react in certain ways and have certain experiences if exposed to certain stimuli. According to the substance theory, there is something in human beings over and above these items, and something of great importance at that. This extra something is variously referred to as the subject or owner of the experiences, as the spiritual substance which underlies them and which gives a human being the unity he possesses. Among those holding this type of theory, there are differences of opinion as to the manner in which the underlying subject is known, and also as to how much we can know about it. According to one group, including Sir William Hamilton and many other philosophers influenced by Kant, no such spiritual substance is given in introspective experience. Its existence has to be inferred in order to account for such facts as our personal identity, which could not otherwise be explained. Writers who adopt this point of view are usually rather modest in their claims of how much can be known about the attributes of the underlying self. Other philosophers maintain that the substance self is given in experience. In fact, it is given in every experience. The German philosopher Lutze was a prominent defender of this position. In a well-known passage, he wrote, "It has been required of any theory which starts without presuppositions and from the basis of experience, that in the beginning it should speak only of sensations and ideas, without mentioning the soul, to which, it is said, we hasten without justification to ascribe it. I should maintain, on the contrary, that such a mode of setting out involves a willful departure from that which is actually given in experience. A mere sensation without a subject is nowhere to be met with as a fact. It is impossible to speak of a bare movement without thinking of the mass whose movement it is. And it is just as impossible to conceive a sensation existing without the accompanying of that which has it, or rather of that which feels it. For this also is included in the given fact of experience that the relation of the feeling subject to its feeling, whatever its other characteristics may be, is in any case something different from the relation of the moved element to its movement. It is thus and thus only that the sensation is a given fact, and we have no right to abstract from its relation to its subject, because this relation is puzzling, and because we wish to obtain a starting point which looks more convenient, but is utterly unwarranted by experience. Many, though not all, of the writers holding this position believe that the self, which is thus given in every experience, is not only simple and abiding the same during all the varying modes of consciousness, but is furthermore indestructible and therefore immortal. According to the bundle theory, a human being is nothing over and above factors A, B, C, and D listed above. There are no facts which warrant the inference to a permanent underlying spiritual substance, nor is such a self ever given in experience. We are apt to mistake as an owner of our experiences certain background feelings or sensations which generally accompany them. We are angry against a background mood of depression, or we read a letter against a background feeling of delight or disappointment, as the case may be. And practically all our experiences are accompanied by some marginal bodily sensations of our breathing, our eyeball movements, our satisfactory or moving, our stationary or moving limbs, our hunger or satiety, our bodily tensions, and many more. Bertrand Russell has been one of the outstanding champions of the bundle theory in our own day. We think and feel and act, he writes in one place. But there is not, in addition to thoughts and feelings and actions, a bare entity, the mind or the soul, which does or suffers these occurrences. The mental continuity of a person is a continuity of habit and memory. There was yesterday one person whose feelings I can remember, and that person I regard as myself of yesterday. But in fact, myself of yesterday was only certain mental occurrences which are now remembered and are regarded as part of the person who now recollects them. The classical formulation of this view is found in Hume's treatise on human nature. For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. When my perceptions are removed for any time, as by sound sleep, so long am I insensible of myself, and may truly be said not to exist. And were all my perceptions removed by death, and I could neither think nor feel nor see nor love nor hate after the dissolution of my body, I should be entirely annihilated. Nor do I conceive what is further requisite to make me a perfect nonentity. If anyone, upon serious and unprejudiced reflection, thinks he has a different notion of himself, I must confess I can reason no longer with him. Oh, please stop doing that. I must confess I can reason no longer with him. All I can allow him is that he may be in the right as well as I, and that we are essentially different in this particular. He may perhaps perceive something simple and continued, which he calls himself. Though I am certain there is no such principle in me. But setting aside some metaphysicians of this kind, I may venture to affirm that the rest of mankind, that they are nothing but a bundle of collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity, and are in a perpetual flux and movement. It should be added that some contemporary philosophers go further than Russell and Hume and declare that the substance theory is meaningless. The spiritual substance is not like a mythical animal, which we could recognize if we came across it, but which, as a matter of fact, does not exist. We don't even know what it would be like to come across it. The point is not, in Ayer's words, that the vast majority of men are unable to perform the difficult feat of experiencing themselves as substances. It is rather that such a feat is not conceivable. There's nothing that would count as stumbling upon oneself, as opposed to some particular perception. To many philosophers, it has seemed that interactionism is open to a number of fatal objections. These are all the interactionists that we just talked about. Regardless of whether it conceives the mind as a substance or as a bundle. It is easy enough, the critics have declared, to speak of interaction between body and mind in general terms. As soon, however, as we try to visualize concretely the manner in which the supposed interaction takes place, we are utterly baffled. How exactly, for example, is the last member of the physiological series following the impact of light rays on the retina transformed into a visual sensation? What exactly does a volition do to the brain molecules to set in motion the train of events culminating in the person's overt reaction? It is evident that the brain molecules must somehow be moved for this purpose. But how can something which does not occupy space and which has no extension move a material particle? In the words of W.K. Clifford, a 19th century mathematician and philosopher, if anybody says that the will influences matter, the statement is not true, but it is nonsense. The will is not a material thing. It is not a mode of material motion. The only thing which influences matter is the position of surrounding matter, or the motion of surrounding matter. There is an enormous gulf and impassable chasm, a gap which cannot be bridged between phenomena as radically different as brain events on the one hand, and psychological events like sensations or volitions on the other. Moreover, interactionism seems to these philosophers inconsistent with the continuity of physiological processes and also with certain well-established principles of physics. From the point of view of physiology and physics, it is argued mental events which cause or are caused by bodily events are disturbing and unwanted interlopers for which there is no room. If the causal story were what the interactionists believed it to be, then we would expect a break in the physiological sequences in the body in certain times. The last brain event, for instance, would be followed not by another brain event, but by a non-physical event, the sensation. This by another non-physical event, the volition. And this, then, by the outgoing physiological sequence. In actual fact, however, the critics claim no such interruption or discontinuity in the physiological processes is ever found. Even worse, perhaps, interaction appears to be in conflict with the law of the conservation of energy. This principle, in one of its most familiar formulations, maintains that the amount of energy in the universe is always constant. This means that energy can be neither created nor destroyed. Yet, if interaction occurs, then energy would be lost when the body affects the mind, and energy would be gained when the mind affects the body. We should, in all such cases, have we should have exceptions to the conservation of energy. There is, however, no evidence that such violations of the principle take place. The occurrence of sensations, for example, is not, as far as we know, accompanied by decreases of energy in the body, nor are volitions followed by increases of energy. In the light of these and similar considerations, numerous philosophers regard interactionism as untenable. They have put forward several alternative theories which would avoid the difficulties we mentioned. Perhaps the simplest of these is the theory known as monistic or reductive materialism. On this view, all physiological terms really refer to some kind of physiological events or processes. It maintains, to use another formulation, that matter alone is real, that a human being is simply his body. This is the position to which we briefly referred at the beginning of this introduction. Reductive materialism has been held in many different forms. The 18th century physiologist Cabanis asserted that thought is a secretion of the brain. a view echoed by the German biologist Vogt, who wrote that, quote, "The relation between thought and the brain is roughly of the same order as that between bile and the liver, or urine and the bladder." Hobbes and some German materialists of the 19th century believed that thought is nothing more than the movement of particles in the brain, and the Danish physiologist Lang claimed that emotions are really nothing but functional disturbances of the body. However, most of these writers also expressed their moderate views not compatible with reductive materialism. Early in the 20th century, the German chemist Ostwald and his followers claimed that mental processes are a form of physical energy. In our own day, the favorite type of reductive materialism is behaviorism, or at any rate, certain specially radical forms of it. Some behaviorists, it is true, do not maintain that consciousness is identical with any bodily processes, but others, or the same behaviorists on other occasions, maintain that all physiological terms really refer to nothing more than maintain that all psychological terms really refer to nothing more than bodily reactions of some kind, to actual bodily responses or to dispositions to respond in certain ways. In spite of these attractive features, the great majority of philosophers reject reductive materialism. They maintain that it is simply not a true account of our experience. To talk of thought as a secretion is absurd. Bile and urine are substances which can be publicly observed, which occupy space, which can be weighed and even bottled. None of this is true of our thoughts. If, for example, I think of Freud's theory of the death instinct, or of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, my thoughts are not publicly observable. They do not occupy space. They cannot be weighed or bottled. It seems no less absurd to identify thoughts with movement of brain molecules or emotions with contractions and dilations of blood vessels. It may well be the case that thoughts are always accompanied by certain molecular motions, and that emotions always occur along with certain contractions and dilations of blood vessels. But this does not mean that the mental events are the bodily processes. To say that thought is really nothing but a certain movement, as the German philosopher Friedrich Paulsen put it in his celebrated critique of reductive materialism, is about as sensible as to say that iron is really made of wood. Turn it which way you will, you will never find a thought in movement. The common man knows nothing whatever of the motion in the brain or of the vasomotor process, but he knows what anger is and what thought is, and he means these when he speaks of them, and not something else of which the physiologist alone knows or thinks he knows. It is also not the case that sensations are identical with any kind of bodily process or reaction. A person's awareness of red, for example, cannot be the same thing as a molecular movement. It makes sense to talk about the molecular movement. Such questions as, is it swift or slow, straight or circular? But as Broad has argued, it would make no sense at all to raise these questions about the awareness of red. Conversely, it makes perfectly good sense to talk about the awareness, whether it is clear or confused. But such a question could not sensibly be asked about a molecular movement. If a person touches a piece of red-hot iron, to use an illustration given by Ewing, The throb of pain he feels is not at all like the act of withdrawing his hand, nor like anything described in textbooks of physiology as happening in the nervous system or the brain. The difference between sensations and bodily events, Ewing insists, is not a question of a priori speculative metaphysics, but, quote, as much an empirical matter as that between sight and sound. Another rival to interactionism is the theory known as epiphenomenalism. On this view, mental events are distinct from any kind of physical substances or movements. They are, however, powerless to interfere with anything in the physical world. Mental states are caused by brain processes, but do not in turn exert any causal influence. They are mere byproducts. Epiphenomenon is the Greek for byproduct. Mere accompanying echoes or shadows of bodily events, only material structures, including, of course, human bodies and their parts, are causally active. In the words of Santayana, one of the most famous advocates of this theory, there are not two parallel streams, but one stream which is slipping over certain rocks or dropping into certain pools, begins to babble a wanton music, not thereby losing any part of its substance or changing its course, but unawares, enriching the world with a new beauty. Consciousness is a lyric cry in the midst of business. In our book, Epiphenomenalism is defended by T.H. Huxley in The Automaton Theory. Epiphenomenalism is usually considered a form of materialism, and perhaps a few words of explanation are needed about the meanings of this term in philosophical discussion. We may discuss a narrower and a broader sense. In the narrower sense, materialism asserts that whatever exists is material or physical. In this view, mental events, insofar as they really exist, are a subclass of physical occurrences. In the broader sense, materialism merely asserts that matter is in some way the primary or most fundamental reality. In the latter sense, somebody could be a materialist and at the same time allow that there are mental processes which are not a subclass of physical occurrences. In this sense, dualism and materialism are not contradictory theories in this sense. Epiphenomenalism is not a form of materialism in the narrower sense, but it clearly is a form of materialism in the broader sense. In the broader sense, even quite a number of dualistic interactionists could be regarded as materialists. There are many interactionists who, after conceding that mind is distinct from body and that there is causal influence both ways, proceed to maintain that matter can exist without mind, but that mind cannot exist without matter, or at least that this is highly probable on the basis of a great deal of empirical evidence. Bertrand Russell and Hume adopt such a position in several places. Thus, Russell likens the relation between mental events and the brain to that between a river and a riverbed. When the brain is dissolved at death, there is no more reason to suppose that mental events will continue than that a river, quote, will persist in its old course after an earthquake has raised a mountain where a valley used to be. Moreover, a riverbed can exist without a river, but a river cannot exist without a riverbed. And the same holds for the mind and the body. Writers like Russell may be considered materialists in the broader sense, since they do assert that matter is more basic in the way just explained. Some philosophers, usually classified as materialists, have proposed a theory which is at least fairly similar to epiphenomenalism, and which may or may not coincide with it, depending on how the notions of thing and quality are interpreted. On this view, mental processes are not a species of physical occurrences, and to this extent, the theory is dualistic. On the other hand, mental processes cannot be described as things. Only physical objects are things. Mental processes are qualities or attributes of physical organisms. A human body not only has size and shape and a certain weight and certain colors, it also has certain intellectual and emotional attributes. This view is found, among others, in the writings of the French physician and philosopher Lemaitre, and the English chemist and religious reformer Joseph Priestley. Both Lemaitre and Priestley strenuously opposed the view that matter is essentially passive or inert, and maintained that feeling and thought could be attributed as powers to human and animal bodies on the basis of the same kind of evidence by which we attribute powers of attraction and repulsion to matter in general. Thought is so little incompatible with organized matter, quote, wrote Lemaitre, quote, that it seems to be one of its properties on a par with electricity, the faculty of motion, impenetrability, and extension. However, to return to epiphenomenalism, it does not identify mental events with any kind of physiological processes and therefore circumvents the main difficulty of reductive materialism. But in the opinion of many philosophers, it too is open to a number of serious objections. In the first place, since it allows causal influence in the direction from body to mind, epiphenomenalism escapes only half of whatever difficulties beset interactionism. Secondly, it has been charged that epiphenomenalism is a self-stultifying theory. If it were true, we could never be justified in believing that it is true. For if it were true, then all our beliefs are entertained not because of any prior awareness of good grounds or adequate evidence, but solely because of physical changes in the brain and nervous system. None of our conclusions, including epiphenomenalism itself, would be based on logic. We would always think, in J.B. Pratt's words, quote, the way our mechanical brains constrain us to think. And if, in any given case, our thought is true, that is so because the brain molecules happen to shake down in a lucky fashion, unquote. Perhaps the most momentous objection to epiphenomenalism consists in the enormous quantity of prima facie evidence that the mental processes of human beings do make a difference to their lives and indirectly to inanimate nature as well. It is said that epiphenomenalism implies a truly staggering paradox in this connection. Father Meyer, a scholastic critic, has stated this objection very forcefully. But reflection discovers consequences still more surprising. The whole past of the history of the world, the building of cities, the invention of machinery, the commerce of nations, the immigrations of peoples, the rise and fall of civilizations. All this has been done on this planet by human beings. Might have happened in precisely the same way if there had never awoke to consciousness a single human mind. All the pain and sorrow, all the joy and gladness, all the love and anger, all that we suppose have governed the world's history might never have been, and that history might have run exactly the same course. The neural groupings, the cerebral movements, which were the true, ultimate, and only causes of the various actions of human beings, have never once been interrupted, modified, or interfered with by those aspects or phases which constitute the parallel series of conscious states. Since the first man appeared on Earth, given the original collocation of the material atoms from which the present cosmos has evolved, and every event down to the last incident of our daily lives was therein rigidly and sufficiently determined, even though no single act of intelligence or volition had ever wakened into life. That's one B. Really? Really? That's what you think? It was well said. Anyway, interactionism may have its problems, but according to a number of philosophers, they are small when compared with this paradox of epiphenomenalism. Epiphenomenalists would probably retort that this criticism is based on a misunderstanding of their theory. I think so. They would maintain that terms like willing, reasoning, knowing, or forecasting really have a double meaning. They do indeed refer to certain conscious states, but they also refer to certain states of the organism. They also refer, that is, to the bodily processes which cause the mental epiphenomena. I'm sorry, refer to certain, to the bodily processes which cause the mental phenomena. The reductive materialists are wrong in denying the conscious accomplishments. Critics like Father Meyer are guilty of the opposite error of tacitly equating ourselves with our mental states exclusively. To give a simple illustration, a person may quite properly be said to know how to drive a car, even if on a given occasion he makes all the appropriate responses without consciously attending to them. The question at issue, an epiphenomenalist would contend, is not whether willing, reasoning, knowing, forecasting, and the rest are causally relevant to what happens in the world. For this much is admitted by him no less than by the interactionist. The question is whether we need to bring in something over and above the body's knowledge, willing, reasoning, and forecasting. Whether we have to attribute causal relevance to the conscious side of these phenomena as well. If it is maintained that the body alone could never bring about such splendid results as Mozart's operas or the feats of modern, or the feats, it should be the feats, I think. Oh yeah, the feats of modern engineering. It is the feats. An epiphenomenalist would answer, following Spinoza, that nobody has ever discovered the body's limitations and that this criticism rests therefore on a gratuitous assumption. He would perhaps conclude his answer with the recommendation that we should cease to identify ourselves so exclusively with our conscious lives. Another alternative to interactionism is the view known as parallelism, which agrees with epiphenomenalism in denying any influence of mental states over our bodies, but which goes further in also denying causal relations in the other direction. The life of a human being, on this view, consists of two distinct series which never intersect. When light strikes my eye, and this is followed by a visual sensation, there is no causal connection between those processes, since the former belongs to the physical and the latter to the mental series of my life. Again, if I eat a chocolate eclair filled with whipped cream, this is usually followed by a feeling of pleasure. But according to parallelism, the two events are not causally related. In both of these, and in all similar instances, there's only a relation of concomitance or of temporal succession. Most parallelists have not been satisfied to let the matter rest here. They felt obliged to explain the universal correlations between certain kinds of bodily and certain kinds of mental events. Example, between certain stimulations of the senses, certain stimulations of the sense organs and the sensations following these, or between volitions and movements of the body. Although these correlations are not causal, parallelists generally concede that they are not accidental either. Historically, there are three major attempts on the part of parallelists to explain such correlations. The first is that of Malebranche and the occasionalists, who maintain that corresponding physical and mental events are occasions for God to become active. The physical contact between my tongue and the chocolate eclair is the occasion for God to produce pleasure in me, and my volition to pick up a fork is the occasion for God's production of this motion. Leibniz, who was also a parallelist, did not believe in the immediate intervention of God on all these occasions, but believed instead that a pre-established harmony exists between the two series. He compared the body and the mind to two clocks, which agree perfectly, and which were from the start made with such, quote, art and accuracy that we can be assured of their future accordance. Similarly, by a divine prevenient contrivance, we're quoting here. Similarly, by a divine prevenient contrivance, body and mind were from the beginning formed so perfect and regulated with so much accuracy that although they follow merely their respective laws, they nevertheless always agree with each other, just as if there were mutual influence, or as if God, in addition to his general cooperation, constantly put his hand there too. Not all parallelists, however, have been believers in God, or have considered it necessary to bring in God's immediate or remote causal activity to explain the correlations between bodily and mental states. Probably the explanation most popular among them has been some form of identity or double aspect theory, which goes back to Spinoza, and which had many outstanding advocates in later centuries, including Fauner, Wundt, Hofding, Paulson, and Clifford. On this view, bodily and mental processes are really at bottom, or ultimately, the same events. They are two aspects of the same reality. They are the same thing viewed from different angles or known in different ways. Keep letting this happen. My goodness. Excuse me. There we go. Known in different ways. Our mental states are the private or inner nature or side of the corresponding brain processes, the publicly observable or outer nature of the same phenomena. Numerous illustrations have been adduced to indicate how on this theory the regular concomitance of mental and physical events would be explained. Fechner gave the example of a curved line, which is on one side convex and on the other side concave. No matter how many turns and twists are found in such a line, a concavity will always correspond to a convexity, although there is no causal connection between them. Another illustration given by the German philosopher Laschwitz is that of a loan of money. The same sum is an asset for one of the parties and a debit for the other. Fiegel compares the body-mind relation to that kind of identity which is discovered by two explorers who, quote, may unwittingly have observed the same mountain from different directions, and only after comparing notes come to realize that it was really identically the same mountain. Most parallelists would go on to assert that brain processes are not the only phenomena which also have an inner nature. All things in the universe including not only human beings and animals, but even plants and what we normally consider inanimate objects, have such an additional inner side. None of them is a purely material structure. All have an aspect which in varying degrees resembles our mental states. Quote, even in the very lowest organisms, even in the amoeba, which swims about in our own blood, writes Clifford, quote, along with every motion of matter, whether organic or inorganic, there is something or other inconceivably simple to us, which is of the same nature with our own consciousness, although not of the same complexity. Just as our bodies are made up of atoms, so our minds are made up of the rudimentary bits of feeling which are attached to each atom and which are its, quote, inner structure, inner nature, unquote. This theory is usually known as panpsychism, but some parallelists do not like the term because it suggests that they claim consciousness for sticks and stones and stars and atoms, whereas they merely claim some resemblance to consciousness. They do not claim self-awareness or introspection for inanimate phenomena. Only human beings and possibly some animals can know their inner nature. Many writers who have adopted this position prefer the term universal parallelism, the assumption that some kind of inner process accompanies every physical event enables them, they assert, to give a consistent causal explanation of all mental states without in any way introducing special divine interferences. Supposing I hear a loud noise of thunder, for example, what is the cause of this sensation? A certain excitation of the auditory nerve and a certain stimulation of the brain, say both the epiphenomenalist and the interactionist. But this answer is not open to the parallelists. Surely the sensation has a cause. Is it then some state of consciousness? This answer is in most cases ruled out because the sensation may follow no state of consciousness, as when a person awakes from dreamless sleep, or it may follow a state of consciousness which cannot possibly be the cause. For example, my sensation of a loud noise may follow a feeling of pleasure, of which it can hardly be the effect. It is at this stage that writers like Paulson and Fechner appeal to their hypothesis of universal parallelism. The causes of the sensation are the inner processes accompanying the excitation of the auditory nerve. The cause of psychical states, like sensations, writes Paulson, are other psychical processes, which are unknown to us, but whose physical equivalents are physical or chemical processes. Contemporary philosophers tend to be repelled by wild speculations. All right, let's pause for a second. Contemporary philosophers tend to be repelled by wild speculations about God's constant interventions in the universe, or a pre-established harmony, or a universal mind stuff, as Clifford called the inner side of physical events. Those philosophers today who are opposed to materialism in all its more radical varieties incline therefore to interactionism in spite of the difficulties with which this theory appears to be confronted. Some of them, like Lord Samuel, may be termed agnostic interactionists. Their position is roughly that while interaction in both directions is as plain and undeniable, in both directions is a plain and undeniable fact, the how of interaction is still a mystery. The meeting place between mind and brain, and exactly what the mind takes over at the meeting place, as Lord Samuel puts it, has not yet been discovered. See Samuel's contribution to the symposium, The Physical Basis of Mind. In this belief, he is supported by many eminent scientists. Thus, Sir Charles Sherrington, who is probably the greatest physiologist of this century, declared that we have to regard the relation of mind to brain as still not merely unsolved, but still devoid of a basis for the very beginning of a solution. Professor Legros Clark, a distinguished Oxford anatomist, writes that physiology and anatomy are unable, quote, even to suggest how the physiochemical phenomena associated with the passage of nervous impulses from one part of the brain to another can be translated into a mental experience. Other contemporary interactionists adopt a more confident approach. They claim that most, if not all, the traditional difficulties of interactionism are altogether spurious. Thus, Ducasse rejects as meaningless the question of how brain processes produce mental events or how mental events produce modifications in the brain. He insists that in general, the question as to how one event causes another is meaningful, quote, only in regards remote causation, since what the problem at how asks is for an account of the causal steps intermediary between the two events concerned. If, for example, it is asserted that a diet rich in animal fats is one of the causal factors responsible for coronary heart attacks, it makes perfectly good sense to ask how this diet produces such results. The cause and the effect are not here proximate members of the same causal series, and the how asks for information about intermediate members in the series, such as the exact processes in the circulatory system consequent upon the consumption of animal fats. On the other hand, the sensation and the last member of the physiological series prior to its occurrence are proximate, and the same is true of the volition and its member of the physiological series following it. Here, the nature of the case makes it impossible to obtain intermediate members, and hence the question how the cause leads to the effect is meaningless. Broad and others also maintain that many of the apparent difficulties of interactionism arise from the tendency to approach the body-mind problem with inappropriate and misleading images. We tend to think of the mind as a little man inside the brain, and of introspection as a kind of looking with eyes turned to the inside of our bodies. We then try to visualize the meeting place of mind and body and the impact of one on the other. When such attempts end in failure, we feel utterly perplexed. According to Broad, the demand to visualize such an impact is illegitimate and shows that its authors, if they are dualists, did not have the courage of their initial conviction to regard mental processes as having no spatial location. The use of words like gap, chasm, or hiatus furthermore suggests difficulties which do not really exist. The gap of the agnostic interactionists cannot be bridged. Nothing less than a rope or a fluid consisting first of a pure matter, then of 90% matter and 10% mind, then of 80% matter and 20% mind, and finally of pure mind would satisfy them once the gap and bridge picture has come to dominate their thinking on this subject. The gap cannot be bridged because there is really no such gap in the first place. The mind is not another physical object, and its relation to the brain cannot be compared to the relation between the banks of a river. Nor does it make sense to speak of translations or transformations of neural impulses into thought, since thought is not another kind of bodily process or physical energy. Who let a fly in here? As to the difficulty based on the conservation of energy, some writers deny that interaction is in any way incompatible with this principle. Others, like Pratt, concede that interaction is incompatible with the conservation of energy. and that the influence of the mind on the body can be saved only on the assumption that it is a, quote, genuine creator of energy, unquote. Although he is therefore willing to deny the universal application of the conservation principle, Pratt insists that the breach is only a very minor one. If we refuse to admit that the laws which control inorganic matter also absolutely dominate that small portion of the material world in which matter comes into relation with personality, how many of the claims of physical science will thereby be undermined? In the whole realm of physics and of chemistry, of astronomy and geology, not one. Mechanical science will be forced to give up its claims to absolute sway only in that tiny realm where personality, or perhaps where life, begins to have influence. In this connection, it is interesting to note that the demand for the absolute universality of physical laws comes, as a rule, not from the physicists, not from the chemists, but from a small number of biologists, a large number of psychologists, and most of all, from the naturalistic school of the philosophers. The mechanistic philosophers are much more royalist than their king, and the demand for the universal sway of the mechanical seems to vary directly with the square of the distance from headquarters. Quite a number of philosophers are satisfied with answers along one or other of these lines and rest content in interactionism. To many others, interaction between the mind and the body remains something incredible. Some of the latter have fallen back on materialist theories. Quite a few are sympathetic to behaviorism. John Dewey and some of his disciples appear to favor a theory along the lines of Lemaitre and Priestley, according to which mental processes are attributes of the body. J.J.C. Smart and U.T. Place have revived an identical theory, or an identity theory with a materialistic flavor, according to which sensations and other psychological occurrences are identical with brain events. Smart and Place deny that their position is a form of reductive materialism and regard any such interpretation as the consequence of a misunderstanding of the meaning of identical in this context. Smart and Place would presumably maintain that when philosophers like Hobbes spoke of thought as a motion in the brain, they too were not necessarily reductive materialists. Yet other philosophers believe that many of the puzzles on this subject are the result of trying to squeeze the relations between body and mind into some standard pattern. It is a unique relation which one can help to describe by comparisons and contrasts with other relations. But once it is identified with any of these relations, we have insoluble problems on our hands, since our customer simply will not fit into the clothes which we have tailored for him. Let's end